more Americans are now turning to buy now, pay later just to cover groceries, and a rising number of them are also falling behind on those payments. Buy now, pay later was once sold as a smarter way to shop. 4 small payments, no interest, no catch. Well, that's not completely true. There is a catch, because behind all of the marketing and convenience, this is still debt. But for a lot of consumers, that distinction didn't really matter, or worse, it was misunderstood.
Yep. When I started this journey, I had $9,500 in debt to Affirm and Klarna. I now have it under $3,000.
Buy now, pay later it's probably one of my number one most hated forms of debt. It's so sneaky.
Today, roughly half of Americans are considered financially illiterate. And just so you know, this is not some super long test that determines this. It has just 5 questions that are multiple choice, much of which are pretty simple and straightforward. Americans have hovered around 50% for the last 8 years, with it actually getting worse over the last 2. So when you combine easy access to credit with a population that doesn't fully understand how loans work, well, it's not hard to understand what happens next. Debt piles up, defaults begin to rise, and the system that was once sold as an alternative to credit card traps ends up pulling them into a new one. This is the story of how buy now, pay later went too far, and why it's likely only going to get much worse from here. The shift from historically financing big ticket items to financing small ticket items is somewhat of an ominous warning. What began as a clever payment tool has gradually become a form of quiet manipulation, nudging people into purchases they can't really afford under the illusion it's financially responsible to do so. While I don't think the product as a whole is inherently bad, I will get to some of the positives later on. In 2022, when the pandemic first hit, spending habits shifted almost overnight. Online shopping surged, and people were flush with stimulus money. For people who didn't want to pay for something up front, or perhaps didn't already have a credit card, buy now, pay later offered something that felt safer. Split a purchase into smaller pieces, often with no interest, and most importantly, no hard credit checks. Currently, there's really 4 big players in this industry right now. Those companies are Affirm, Klarna, Afterpay, and PayPal, all of which have moved aggressively, embedding themselves in checkout flows at thousands of retailers, relentlessly competing with one another over who can get an exclusive contract with big-name retailers. And early on, the market really rewarded them for this. Klarna and Affirm both hit a valuation over $45 billion. Afterpay was acquired in 2022 by Block for $29 billion. Block is formerly known as Square, and they own Cash App. And during this hype, PayPal's stock reached over $300 a share, whereas today, it sits at around $65. But anyways, around this time, buy now, pay later went from what looked like a niche tool to beginning to look like the future of consumer finance. That was until people started to look a bit closer at the details. And like with most things in fintech, they're often just creating problems for future solutions they hope to solve. For a while, there was almost no real competition from traditional banks and credit card companies. While of course they offered similar products in terms of the BNPL category, they were much slower to react, and credit card companies heavily underestimated this trend. But as BNPL ballooned in popularity, legacy players and fintech giants began quietly building their own alternatives, signaling that the easy wins might be over for them. It is worth noting though that these newer BNPL companies were operating in a regulatory gray area when compared to more traditional credit card companies or banks. But as the products grew in popularity, it would become under greater scrutiny from regulators. However, by the time the government actually stepped in, it might have been a little too late. The cracks emerged, and behind the rapid growth, the warning signs were already there. Buy now, pay later might have been too easy to use. As it took off in 2020, it stopped being just a tool for financing big ticket items like laptops or Peloton bikes and started being used to finance clothes, groceries, gas, and as of recently, DoorDash. Klarna just partnered with DoorDash to make it possible to finance a $20 meal over time. Now for some, this may sound convenient, but it's also a huge red flag. There's a big difference between financing an outfit and financing dinner. What began as what looked like an innovative product is now beginning to look more like desperation. It appears people are increasingly using this product for basic necessities just to get by. And because most buy now, pay later providers don't report to credit bureaus and rarely verify income, users can stack multiple loans across different platforms without anyone really keeping track. By 2022, more than 60% of BNPL users had multiple active loans, and 32% of them were borrowing from 3 or more providers simultaneously. Some users didn't even realize that these were loans or that a missing payment could land them in collections. Now, as usage spiked, defaults quietly began to rise. Affirm's 30-day delinquency reached 2.4% by 2024. Klarna, once one of Europe's most valuable private companies, slashed its valuation by 85%, laid off 10% of its workforce, and pivoted from growth mode to survival mode. The deeper problem began to look like who these loans were being approved for. According to the CFPB, in 2022, buy now, pay later lenders approved 78% of applications from subprime or deep subprime borrowers. These borrowers made up the majority of the buy now, pay later loans, with deep subprime consumers accounting for 45% and subprime borrowers another 16%. Now, at this time, for buy now, pay later loans, the default rate was around 2%, which is much lower than the average credit card default rate, sitting at 10%. But that's not the whole story, because most buy now, pay later platforms require automatic payments, which artificially suppresses delinquencies, at least until a user's bank account runs dry. Now, by the time regulators actually stepped in, the industry had already scaled. In 2024, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau finally announced that BNPL providers would need to comply with US credit card laws. But by then, many large players already followed parts of those guidelines. The real issue is that most buy now, pay later loans don't show up on credit reports, meaning consumers can rack up debt with almost no visibility. And while regulators had largely ignored BNPL during its meteoric rise, now they weren't the only ones paying attention. Because traditional banks were pushing for tougher oversight too, not necessarily because they feared consumer harm, but because they feared losing market share. Now, I think it's important to step back and ask a simple question. How do these companies actually make money? Because anytime something looks a little too good to be true, like splitting up a purchase into 4 payments with no interest, the first thing I'm wondering is, what's in it for them? And I don't think I'm alone in that. BNPL companies aren't traditional lenders. They don't make most of their money from charging interest like credit cards do. Instead, they rely on a fragile ecosystem of merchant fees, consumer fees, and some longer-term loans, all of which work if people only keep spending and keep paying on time. So let's break it down. First, the merchant fee. Every time you use a BNPL product, the retailer pays a cut, usually between 2 and 8% of the transaction. This goes to the buy now, pay later provider. Now, that fee is actually higher than what retailers usually pay on a credit card transaction. But merchants are willing to eat that higher fee because BNPL tends to boost cart size and it reduces friction at checkout. In other words, it's going to help them close more sales, so they'll take the hit. But what most people don't realize is that BNPL companies front the cash to the retailer up front. Let's say you buy an Xbox from Walmart using Affirm. Affirm pays Walmart, and then you owe Affirm. The retailer doesn't take on any of the risk. If you don't pay Affirm, the company then eats the loss and submits it to collections, which will eventually end up on your credit history. But then there's the consumer fees. While most BNPL plans are marketed as no interest, late fees are quietly built in. Companies like Afterpay and Klarna have made millions off of penalties from missed payments. And because repayments are often tied to automatic withdrawals, people might not even realize they've overdrafted their account until the damage is done. And then the bank's gonna hit you on an overdraft fee. And the third way they make money is the longer term loans. This is where companies like Affirm really lean in. They offer 6, 12, or even 60-month payment plans with real interest rates. Now, for these loans, they will likely pull your credit and see if you qualify for the loan. These aren't the 4 easy payments you see at checkout. They're closer to traditional financing, and they bring in more revenue per user. Now, there's also ancillary services that these companies are beginning to lean into as they start to see the cracks in their business model. Klarna and others have tried to diversify by turning their apps into shopping platforms, selling advertising space to brands, and even launching premium subscriptions. In 2024, Klarna's revenue broke down to 64% merchant fees, 12% consumer fees, and 24% from interest or other services. So on the surface, to some, it may seem sustainable, but here's the fatal flaw. The entire business model only works if default rates stay low. These companies front the cost of the purchase, hoping they get paid back, and if a user stops paying, especially someone who's already juggling multiple loans, there's no safety net. There's no assets to repossess, there's just a loss. So as default rates climb, the already thin margins that BNPL companies operate on can start to collapse. It's a model built for scale, but scale only works when consumers behave perfectly, and increasingly, it appears consumers don't. Now, buy now, pay later initially set out to disrupt traditional credit, but ended up getting absorbed by it. Credit card companies like American Express and MasterCard, Chase Bank all have rolled out their own pay over time options, using the same idea but with stricter underwriting and often lower interest rates than what many users were already paying on their credit cards. And by the time regulators got involved in 2024, the era of fast, frictionless, unregulated lending appears to be over, at least somewhat. And for a business model built on scale, optimism, and minimal oversight, that's a problem. To make matters worse, most of these companies weren't profitable even during their boom. Affirm didn't post a profit until early 2025. Klarna only turned a corner in 2024 after laying off staff and slashing costs. Afterpay's profitability came under the umbrella of Block and only after the hype wave had already crashed. So now with costs rising and risk increasing, buy now pay later companies are being forced to grow up fast. It's a pattern we've seen before. In the early 2000s, lenders handed out mortgages without verifying income, believing that home prices would rise forever. In the early 2020s, BNPL providers handed out loans for sneakers, Uber rides, and pizza slices, believing consumers would always pay. Different decade, different product, same mistake. Easy credit creates artificial booms, and when the economy tightens, the defaults reveal just how much risk was hiding underneath the surface. Now, to be fair, buy now, pay later isn't always a trap. Used responsibly, it can help smooth out expenses, avoid high interest credit card debt, and offer some flexibility for people who need to spread out a one-time cost. In the right hands, it certainly could be a tool. But let's be honest, if everyone using buy now, pay later were financially responsible, these companies probably wouldn't exist, because their business model relies on something that's always in short supply: perfect consumer behavior. So for now, buy now, pay later isn't collapsing, at least not yet. It's just being reined in, reshaped by regulation, beginning to compete with traditional lenders, and forced to operate in a new world. The biggest players will likely adapt, shifting toward more conventional lending models, and the smaller ones, well, they'll either get acquired or fade out as the margins disappear. For consumers, what's left is just another form of credit. But at the end of the day, buy now, pay later was never really about making things easier to manage. It was about making it easier to say yes, even when you probably shouldn't. And that's the part that never changes.